My friend and colleague, the Reverend Jim Rigby, who is also one of my many mentors, serves a church in Austin, Texas called St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church. He recently told this story of a pastor in Dallas, Texas. There's a church in Dallas, a very large church, that recently sang the anthem, "Make America Great Again." And this is a statement by their senior pastor in his sermon on that same Sunday. The senior pastor of this Dallas church said, "When I am looking for a leader who is going to fight ISIS and keep America secure, I don't want some meek and mild leader or somebody who is going to turn the other cheek." In response to that statement, Jim Rigby says in his storytelling, "Now that's amazing. That's amazing for a Christian pastor to get up and say, he is going to teach you this turn the other cheek stuff, but that's when you don't have power. When you have power, or there is something important on the line, the same pastor says, I don't want that. I want somebody who fights dirty." So we have some work to do in understanding where Jesus is coming from. Indeed, we do. What Jim is pointing out in the telling of this story is that pastors not only have a variety of perspectives on what Jesus was talking about in our text today, they also use the Bible in ways that are convenient rather than uncomfortable, and often in an attempt to create or hold on to power, particularly if that power is white power. What I appreciate about Jim's story and the ensuing sermon is that he names what is true by saying, I'm not really sure what Jesus meant in this text because it's confusing. But here's what I think based on everything I know about Jesus. Pastors often feel as if we need to make it seem like the Bible is clear when it's anything but clear. I'm with Jim on this text for today. It's confusing, and I'm not sure it gives us the kind of definitive statement we're looking for, but it certainly gives us some food for thought. We're beginning a sermon series on violence and nonviolence, because if you've been paying attention throughout the summer as the liberation movement has intensified, headlines in both secular and church publications have been asking, where is the church in this movement? In the August 12th issue of Christianity Today, one headline read, "Portland is still protesting, where is the church?" In the July 24th issue of the Deseret News, the headline was, "Where are churches in the Black Lives Matter movement?" And in an early June issue of the Houston Chronicle, the headline was, "Churches, once crucial in the civil rights movement, face a new challenge after George Floyd." The question of where churches are is a great one. The answer, quite complex. And some of it may have to do with our text for today, which some interpret as a call to nonviolence. Was Jesus calling us to nonviolence? Or was Jesus calling us to something even more basic than that? When we look to the Bible to understand Jesus, it's complicated in part because scholars aren't all in agreement about which words Jesus actually said and which words were attributed to Jesus that Jesus might or might not have said. The text we are diving into this morning is often misinterpreted to mean that under no circumstances can someone resist when being harmed, and that when someone is taking advantage of us, we are to give them even more. Now, the last part of what Ray read is enough for any of us to just sit down and give up. Give to anyone who asks of you, and do not refuse anyone who would like to borrow from you. Wow. That has serious consequences. But many people would say Jesus wasn't speaking in this text literally. So we have some uncovering to do. Many in this congregation are familiar with this text because of the ways that Walter Wink, in his series on the powers that be, untangled this text and wove a new narrative with it. Wink was a scholar and theologian and an important voice in progressive Christianity. Instead of justifying being able to use this text against someone being abused or harmed in some way, Walter Wink uses this text as one that in every turn involved the one being harmed reclaiming their power without resorting to violence. Wink was clear that this text was a text of resistance. In the resistance, however, the one resisting is not supposed to become like the one who is doing the harm. If someone slaps you, don't slap them back, but instead put them in the uncomfortable position of having to backhand you with their left hand, which was not supposed to be used, since that was the hand used for unsanitary things. If someone takes your cloak, don't take theirs, but put them in the uncomfortable position of having to see you naked when you give them your last piece of clothing. If someone asks you to walk a mile carrying their pack when a mile was all that was legal, put them in the uncomfortable position of breaking the law when you carry their pack for 2 miles. It seems clear that Jesus was not encouraging passivity or encouraging allowing yourself to be harmed, but what is not as clear is if this text is one we can use to say that Jesus taught nonviolence. In order for us to know what we're talking about, let's look a little more closely at violence. In 1971, the Catholic Archbishop of Recife, Brazil, Dom Helder Camara, wrote a small book about the social impact of violence called Spiral of Violence. While the book might have been small, the explanation and the theory was powerful. Helder was living under a repressive regime in Brazil at the time. He was definitely considered a revolutionary. He was adamant about the depth of social change needed, and he was convinced that the change needed to be brought about nonviolently. According to Helder's Spiral of Violence, violence number 1 is injustice. This can be anything that violates another person's personhood. Injustice is often subtle, institutionalized destruction of human possibility. It's constant, but it's also rarely seen or known by those who are comfortably situated. Injustice happens when people are objectified rather than subjectified. Thomas Aquinas, a 12th century church scholar, said, "Any law that is unjust is an act of violence rather than a law." When violence number 1, injustice, becomes too oppressive, violence number 2 occurs, which Dom Helder called revolt. Robert McAfee Brown, who wrote a book called Religion and Violence, says, such violence often involves physical destructiveness, sometimes on a massive scale, depending on the number and efficiency of those who revolt. Violence as revolt is directed against the status quo, against those who have the power and are responsible for the injustice, by those who feel that they have been denied power and justice and personhood. Violence as revolt, then, takes place when injustice has reached the place where a large group of people will no longer bear it passively or silently. Well, as you might have guessed, violence number 2, revolt, leads to violence number 3, which is repression. When confronted with revolt, those in power will do anything they can to ensure that their power is not threatened. And this is important. Often the term law and order is used to carry out the repression and make it look justified. And this is where the spiral begins again, with repression leading to greater injustice, which leads to more revolt, which leads to even worse repression. Here in the US and in many other places as well, the focus tends to be trying to stop the spiral in the middle where the revolt happens. That's often where we focus our attention. We can't be sure about whether or not Jesus knew about the spiral of violence in that same way, but we do know it was present even in first century Palestine. The Roman Empire was a repressive and oppressive regime. What was Jesus' response to the injustices and the oppression, the revolts, the revolutions, and then the worse repression? Was Jesus simply the passive, suffering servant so many in power have always used him to portray? One way to look at this question is to look at which part of the spiral of violence Jesus talked most about, or where in that spiral Jesus spent most of his time. It seems safe to say that in the stories we have in the Bible about Jesus, and so many of the words that are attributed to Jesus, most of his time was spent with those who were suffering from injustice, rather than with those who were creating or causing the injustice. There were some exceptions as Jesus addressed the Romans or religious leaders on occasion. But most days for Jesus were spent with the people who were being oppressed, the people who needed food, who needed healing, who were lost. What gets confusing is that in Matthew 5, we read our text today about turning the other cheek, and then 5 chapters later in Matthew 10, Jesus says, I have not come to bring peace on this earth, but the sword. I have come to set a family member against another family member. But if there's an overarching truth that seems to underlie Jesus' teaching, it seems to be something along these lines. Don't match evil with evil. Do not become the very thing you are resisting or the very people you are resisting. You are beloved child of God, and so act like it no matter what or who is trying to harm you. I'm oversimplifying, of course, and not speaking to the occasional texts that are different from this. Remember in August when we were talking about embodied spirituality and we discussed Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands? In that book, he talks about our lizard brains and how when they take over, we either fight, flee, or freeze. What Jesus seems to be talking about so much of the time is that we can make choices to overcome those lizard brains, and we can choose to remain grounded, centered, embodied, even in the midst of injustice. That does not mean that Jesus was a pushover. Quite the opposite was true. I would not have wanted to be on the receiving end of Jesus' anger or of his speaking truth to power. Jesus' words were his sword. If you think about it, though, from the stories we read, Jesus was never hooked into becoming like his enemies. Going back to my friend Jim Rigby, Jim talks about this text as a portrayal of Jesus being like a Zen master. I hadn't thought about it in quite those terms, but I think he's onto something. A Zen state of mind is one in which we are at peace with our own thoughts and our own place in the universe. We're able to remain non-reactive and grounded. We're not attached to our own self-righteousness or way of thinking, but neither are we attached to anyone else's attempts to rob us of our peace or our humanity. Jim also uses the imagery of spiritual judo, and I love that imagery because the two main principles of judo are maximum efficiency with minimum effort and mutual welfare and benefit. In so many stories about Jesus, we see Jesus resisting those in power with both of those principles. With his words, Jesus could cut through anything to get to the heart of an issue. Something else that is important to observe, though, particularly in a conversation about violence, is that Jesus often spoke up on behalf of doing the least amount of harm. When accused of working on the Sabbath because he healed a man, Jesus spoke up about the intention of the law of Sabbath keeping. It wasn't intended to do more harm, but to restore health to people in different ways. When accused of picking grain on the Sabbath with his disciples because they were hungry, Jesus responded by saying, there's a greater principle at work. The Sabbath was never meant to result in people going hungry. While I can't say that Jesus was 100% clear on the subject of nonviolence, what I can say is that there seems to be something far more basic to what Jesus was teaching. And it had to do with holding on to ourselves and not letting people who are evil or violent or oppressive rob us of who we are or rob us of the love we have in our hearts for ourselves, for our neighbors, for God. In the face of evil and evildoers, even if those people are the religious ones or the political ones or the ones in power, whatever you do, do not become like them. This principle, this value, this moral, is one of the most foundational of Jesus' teaching. In these times, with our entire country charged with large-scale divisiveness, these words are more important than ever. If you have love in your heart, don't let anyone else rob you of that love. If you have joy in your heart, don't let anyone else rob you of that joy. If you feel peace in your heart, by all means, don't let anyone else take that peace away from you. What do you need to do to resist those who would harm you while holding on to yourself and to who you are as a follower of Jesus Christ? Amen.